Good evening, and welcome. Tonight's tale begins with a widow who never returned, leaving a quiet town buzzing with whispers and uneasy glances. Have you ever wondered how quickly a secret can travel? Where are you listening from tonight? Your living room, the streets, somewhere you thought was ordinary? Imagine such a moment in your own town. Let's begin. On Wednesdays, when the express to the seaside paused long enough to disgorge hats, umbrellas, and an occasional moral failing, Flaxborough Station's buffet took on the air of a parish hall with a till. Mrs Bellamy, who ran it as others run small kingdoms, had stacked sausage rolls like redoubts and polished the vinegar to an ecclesiastical sheen. A card on the counter read, "Orange squash 4d," a price the town considered both modern and just short of insolent. The town, meanwhile, went about its weekly ritual of pretending not to notice itself. Shopkeepers leaned in doorways to inspect the weather, which responded with a neutrality many found unhelpful. Councillor Chubb, in a suit that was always at least a season behind, and sometimes several, arrived for his customary cup of tea and a glance at whoever else had arrived. Two clerks from county works debated a matter of drainage with the gravity of men entrusted with empires. The noon excursion from the coast wheezed, exhaled its tourists, and settled to an idle clanking like a chain complaining about character. It was just after the second tea-urn had given a noise like a drowned trumpet that Porter Vince appeared in the buffet doorway with the particular expression railway men reserve for news that ought to be passed to someone else. He held out a black handbag, stout, beaded, and unmistakably of the kind that had once known mourning. "Left in the gentleman's waiting room," he announced, with a tactful effort not to implicate his own sex. "On the bench under the timetable." Mrs Bellamy looked at the bag as if it might ask for change. "And why," she said, "should a lady put her handbag in the gentleman's?" "That," said Vince, "would be for her memoirs." Councillor Chubb, not a man to resist additional material for his view of municipal decline, leaned in. "One might suppose there was a gentleman with it," he speculated, "or that the lady was merely passing through to the other side." He gave a small cough at the geography of this. Mrs Bellamy undid the clasp with a proprietary click. Out came a handkerchief with an embroidered edge, a pawn ticket from Vine Street, a small bottle of something that declared itself tint, ebony, hair, and smelled faintly of furniture, and the return half of a rail ticket. Flaxborough, Skegness, day return. Tucked beneath the cardboard was a folded photograph, the sort that arrives already resigned to going missing. Half a couple looked out at them. A woman in a veiled hat, her smile cramped by the photograph's tear. "Widow's things," Mrs Bellamy said, not unkindly. "Or a lady trying for it." "Widow on a day out," ventured Chubb, for whom a narrative was as nourishing as a scone. "Widow coming back. Return half proves it." "Only she didn't," said Vince. He pointed to the ticket. The out half had been clipped with recent enthusiasm. The return sat unpunctured, as virginal as a promise made before lunch. The buffet's interest sharpened. People do not travel in small towns so much as they reappear. The difference furnishes conversation. Already there were witnesses. The Mrs Spaulding, Pale sisters who dealt in wool, declared they had seen a woman in a black veil boarding the morning train with a hat box and a determination. Mr Pargeter from the library thought he had noticed the same person on the down platform earlier, studying the tin advertisement for mustard with what could only be called misgiving. A charwoman from the Crescent, whose work endowed her opinions with a certain polish, believed she had once scrubbed steps for that very handbag. The station master, Mr Drabble, came in at this point with the resigned officiousness of a man whom events insisted on meeting halfway. "Better show me," he said, which he did, peering at the ticket as if it might confess. He was joined by Police Constable Maltby, a conscientious young man whose ambition was to keep his helmet both unbent and obviously used. Maltby listened to Mrs Bellamy, to Vince, to the Spauldings, and then to his own sense of tidy likelihood. "Lost property," he announced, as if formally wedding two words. "We'll log it. Lady will call for it when she notices. People put things down when they mean to pick them up again, then they forget the meaning. Happens." "It was in the gentleman's," Mrs. Bellamy reminded him. "Absent-minded," Maltby suggested, which word he deployed regularly for matters that did not fit entirely into his training. Mr. Drabble considered the pawn ticket. "Coincidence, more likely," he said, to show he could pronounce some too. He squinted at the name penciled on the back of the railway ticket, the way some widows sign the world to keep it from erasing them. "Mrs. V. Quillam." "Quillam," repeated Councillor Chubb, palate-testing the syllables. "I know a Quillam, that yard down near the gasworks, though he wasn't a lady last I looked." "Not all families are single-minded," said Mrs. Bellamy. "V can be Violette, or Vera, or Vesper, if her parents were musical." "Vesper," echoed Mr. Pargeter, library instincts rousing. "That's church, not music." "Both," said Mrs. Bellamy, who had married a bell-ringer. Throughout this, Inspector Purbright stood near the condiments with a paper cup that was not, strictly speaking, improving his opinion of tea. He had come because the station master had telephoned the station police, not because a handbag confers crime. Flaxborough's crimes, those reported, inclined to the more domestic branches of sin, misdirected affection, premature accountancy, and the occasional spasm of civic enthusiasm. Still, Purbright was fond of stations. People arrived and told lies. They departed and took them with them. He watched and did not appear to. He did not, for instance, appear to notice that Mrs. Bellamy had returned the bottle of ebony tint to the bag with an almost motherly disapproval, as if the stuff itself had ambitions she could not endorse. Nor did he seem uncommonly interested in the pawn ticket, though he was at pains to keep it from the draught of Mrs. Bellamy's remark. What he did note, quietly, and only with the smallest alteration in the angle of the paper cup, was the smell of something not hair. Furniture polish leaves behind its own memorial. It lingers under fingernails and on conversation. "Odd, isn't it?" murmured Purbright, as if to himself, "how returns can be the one part of a journey that requires faith." P.C. Multiabe, who had not decided whether this was wisdom or an opinion about train timetables, chose a steadier ground. "Shall I take it along, sir? Register it?" "Yes," Purbright said, with the careful courtesy of a man who has known many registers and what they do to facts. "Note the time, who found it, who held it, who speculated upon it." He looked, without looking, at Councillor Chubb. "We must give posterity every chance." "Mrs. Bellamy found it," said Vince, eager to satisfy posterity while it was listening. "In the gents." "On the bench," added Drabble, who could not bear to see a bench omitted from history. "Thank you," said Purbright. Gossip here, as everywhere, obeyed an iron law. It sought destination. By the time the 1:30 rattled through without stopping, the handbag's owner had been identified no fewer than 3 times, wedded twice, and once cautioned for loitering, by people who would not have known a loiter if it had ordered tea. A widow, decided the town, settling on its preferred narrative because it was both respectable and slightly alarming. A widow who set out for the seaside and never returned. The phrase had a satisfying neatness and required very little from the truth. At 3:45, Mrs. Reeve, the vicar's wife, came in for stamps and the use of a stool. She was brisk, kind, and had a talent for remembering worries before their owners did. On seeing the bag, she made a small noise of recognition, the sort that says, "I've seen you under quieter circumstances." "Oh dear," she said. "Vesper Quillam." "You know her, then?" asked Drabble, grateful for anyone who might be an instruction manual. "Knew," Mrs. Reeve corrected gently. "Or rather, we all did. Vesper's husband rigged boats before the war, very handy with knots. He fell from a ladder, poor man, which made Vesper a widow who never quite learned to be. She took to habits, morning service, Tuesday market, black veil when there wasn't cause enough for it. She touched the beading of the bag with a fingertip reverent for the craft and not the habit. But this is her bag. There's a small tear in the lining. She kept her offertory in it so she could find it in a hurry, and, I always thought, to make sure God saw her doing it. "We found it in the gentleman's," said Mrs. Bellamy, who felt that an important detail had been insufficiently chewed. Mrs. Reeve blinked. Well, she wasn't there. Then, with the practical curiosity of women who have tended other women's subtler afflictions. "When did she lose it?" "Today," said Vince. "Morning train out. Return half unused." Mrs. Reeve's hand went to her scarf, more thought than gesture. "That cannot be." "Why cannot it?" asked Councillor Chubb, priming himself for a passing wrestle with theology. "Because," said Mrs. Reeve, with the faintest look of apology to the room and its stories, "we buried Vesper Quillam in February." The buffet was suddenly a place of soft sounds, cups set down with care, a chair attending to its own indignant creak, someone discovering that the word "o" can be whispered in several directions at once. P.C. Malteby's pencil, having embarked upon the straight road of ordinary lost property, hesitated at a cross-road and did not know it had been given a case. Purbright set his cup on the counter, which improved both the tea and the cup. His face did not alter. It seldom did anything as showy as that in public. But Mrs. Bellamy, who had lived long enough with kettles to hear subtler boilings, saw something pass behind his eyes like a train behind a hedge. "A day return," murmured Purbright, as if tasting the phrase for foreign bodies. "And an owner. Returned to the earth some months ago." He turned, almost apologetic, to Mrs. Reeve. "You're sure?" "I arranged the lilies," she said simply. "It was snowing. The wind blew them the wrong way, and we all decided the churchyard had its own ideas. The stone is there. Quillam, Vesper, 1906 to 1964. The date is not imaginative, Inspector." "February," repeated Purbright, more to the timetable than to anyone present. He considered the little bottle of tint, the pawn ticket, the half-photograph, the return portion innocent of steel. "How very odd," he said, with a civility that refused to disturb the air, for the dead to acquire tickets and the living to mislay their names. And because Flaxborough detests silence that isn't church, the room immediately found itself speaking again, about misprints, impostors, and the capacity of crematoria to issue receipts. The two county works clerks declared that if one were to depend on stones for chronology, the drainage would never go in at all. Councillor Chubb felt that a proper inquiry should be made into the practice of leaving handbags in gentlemen's departments, whether lavatorial or otherwise. Mrs. Bellamy asked if anyone would like another sausage roll, by which she meant that while edibles governed most worry, this one might prove a shade too large for pastry. P.C. Maltby looked to Purbright for an instruction that might shelter him. He received one that did not, quite. "Register it, Constable," Purbright said. "Do not conclude it. Mrs. Bellamy, if anyone comes asking, especially anyone more vivid than they mean to be, would you be kind enough to remember who they were vivid at?" "And the ticket?" asked Drabble, half relief and half dread in him. Purbright glanced at the unpunched card, lying on the counter like a small, confident lie. "Keep it safe, Mr. Drabble. It has not yet done what it says. One must be patient with promises." He smiled then, the sort of private courtesy that never quite reaches the lips, and turned to the window. The light outside had gone indecisive. Clouds arranged a compromise, and gulls, untroubled by theology, disputed chips on the platform. Somewhere down the town, the afternoon market began to pack itself back into barrows and shop fronts. The world went on, as it does, accommodating the impossible in sensible shoes. And in the corner of the buffet, half forgotten in the cradle of the handbag's lining, the little bottle of ebony tint rested where a woman's hand had kept it warm. It had the precise, faintly chemical smell of someone who had decided that appearance is the last thing one can return. The 405 slid in, sighed, and slid out again. No one arrived asking for their bag. Only the story did, and it made itself at home. The discovery of Mrs. Reeves' remark, that the widow Vesper Quillam had already been decently buried some months ago, did not explode through Flaxborough so much as it seeped like a slow but inescapable draught under a church door. Within an hour, the town was full of it. Grocers nodded knowingly while handing over potatoes. Barbers repeated the story with the flourish of men who shave better when mysteries are afoot, and the Spalding sisters, who knitted truth into shapes of their own design, had already claimed that the handbag had contained not one pawn ticket, but 3, and each with a coded message. Inspector Purbright, meanwhile, walked back to the police station at a pace which conveyed neither urgency nor indifference, but something politely between the two. He disliked being observed to hurry. The town's constables and clerks understood this habit well. It was as if Purbright treated mysteries not as emergencies, but as long conversations in which the truth, like a reluctant guest, would eventually confess itself out of courtesy. In his office, with its faint smell of coal dust and its filing cabinet that groaned under the burden of gossip written down, Purbright set the handbag on his desk. He removed the contents once more. The photograph torn neatly across its couple, the pawn ticket, the handkerchief with embroidery now faintly stained, and the unpunched return ticket. He held the bottle of tint up against the lamplight, tilting it as though the sediment might spell out a confession. Sergeant Maltravers entered, his manner solemn with the kind of energy that promised minutes of memoranda. "Sir," he began, "I've checked the register. Vesper Quillam, deceased February. Funeral conducted by Reverend Draycott, certified and witnessed. No doubt whatever. Yet here," Purbright said mildly, "we have her bag. Could it be a coincidence of name, sir? Another Mrs. V. Quillam?" Purbright smiled the way one might when humoring a child who insists that cats can do accounts. "Possible, Maltravers, though unlikely in a town where the surnames breed no faster than the rabbits." The sergeant considered this, frowned, and then suggested, "Grave robbers." Purbright set down the tint bottle with care. Grave robbers do not generally tidy themselves with hair dye. That evening, gossip collected again at the Angel Inn, where tradesmen and clerks exchanged surmises with the dedication of men who otherwise had little chance at being detectives. A theory arose that Vesper Quillam had faked her death to avoid creditors. Another, that her relatives had mistaken someone else's body for hers. Still another insisted that the church burial had been a sham, conducted with a coffin filled with paving stones. Each theory was repeated with a relish that made truth almost unnecessary. The next morning, Purbright called upon Mrs. Reeve at the vicarage. She received him with the brisk kindness she afforded everyone, though her eyes betrayed unease. "Inspector, you do believe me about the burial?" "I was there. We all were." "I have no reason to doubt you," Purbright said. "But perhaps you could tell me, did anyone behave oddly before or during the service?" Mrs. Reeve thought, knitting her fingers as if searching for a dropped stitch. "Well, Vesper's nephew, young Leonard," he stood off to one side behind the yew hedge. "He didn't speak to anyone, not even the Reverend. Looked pale as milk and twice as unsettled. I thought grief, naturally, but he hurried away before the hymn was done." "Leonard Quillam," Purbright repeated softly. "Where does he reside?" "Back of Gasworks Lane, I believe." "Lodging with a widow herself, Mrs. Dawes. Not of the saintly sort." Purbright thanked her, and on his walk back down the narrow lane toward the town centre, the inspector allowed himself a reflection. In Flaxborough, people kept their secrets not behind locked doors, but under plain statements. The trick was never to force the door, but to listen at the wallpaper. That afternoon, Purbright and Constable Maltby visited Gasworks Lane. It smelt of tar, cabbage water, and the persistent fumes of lives half declared. Mrs. Dawes opened her door with the weary suspicion of a woman who expected to be blamed for things she had not yet done. "Leonard?" she said when asked. "He's in the yard, sir. Don't expect brilliance." Leonard Quillam was, indeed, in the yard, bent over a bicycle whose chain lay sulking on the ground. He was thin, his collar loose about his neck, and he greeted Purbright with the wary look of one who suspects questions are never asked for their own sake. "Leonard," Purbright began gently, "we've found a handbag. It belonged to your aunt, Mrs. Vesper Quillam." Leonard's hands stilled on the bicycle chain. His lips parted slightly, then closed again, as though he had caught himself just before letting something slip. "Where?" he asked. "In the gentleman's waiting room at the station. Left yesterday. You'll understand why that strikes us as a little curious." Leonard's eyes darted to the side, then back. "My aunt, she's dead. You know that." "Yes, February. Yet her belongings are not so deceased. How do you account for that?" Leonard swallowed. "Maybe someone else had them. She left things about sometimes." Purbright's tone remained as soft as the air before rain. "Who, for instance, might have kept them since her death?" Leonard hesitated, then shook his head. "I don't know." Maltby, eager to help, asked bluntly, "Did you see her bag after she died?" Leonard's shoulders twitched as though against a draught. "Number I told you. I don't know." He turned back to the bicycle, chain slipping noisily through his fingers. Purbright let the silence sit, heavy and deliberate. Then he nodded, thanked Leonard with impeccable courtesy, and withdrew. On their walk back, Maltby muttered, "He knows more, sir. He's hiding something." "Undoubtedly," Purbright said, "but people who hide often reveal themselves most when left to think they have not been suspected." That evening, as dusk pressed itself against Flaxborough's shop fronts, another detail surfaced. The pawnbroker, Mr. Blenkinsop, presented himself at the station with a ledger under his arm. He had heard, by channels too fast for official inquiry, that a ticket had been found in Vesper's handbag. That ticket, Blenkinsop said, tapping his ledger, was for a wedding ring brought in 2 weeks ago by a man, not a woman. Youngish, nervous, gave the name Quillam. Purbright inclined his head. "Leonard? That would be him, Inspector, though he swore it was his mother's. Odd thing is, Mrs. Vesper Quillam's ring had already been buried with her. I remember because I asked at the time whether she'd be wearing it, and the family said yes." Purbright thanked the pawnbroker and closed the ledger with a deliberate hand. A dead woman's ring pawned by her living nephew. Yet the ring was supposed to lie under stone and snow. Later, in his office, Purbright sat very still, as though listening for the town itself to breathe. The facts were not yet a picture, but the outlines were troubling. A widow buried in February, her bag returned to the world in August, a nephew both evasive and suddenly solvent enough to sell what should not exist. A photograph of a woman torn from her companion, as if a relationship had been surgically excised from memory. He wrote a few notes in his neat, cautious hand. "Bag found, station gents. Return half unused. Pawn ticket equals ring. Ring should be engrave. Leonard nervous. Present at funeral. Ebony tint. Why?" Then he closed the notebook, leaned back in his chair, and allowed himself one of those faint smiles that never reached his lips. Mysteries in Flaxborough were not thunderclaps. They were drips on stone, and the shape they made was only seen when one stood far enough back. Outside, the church clock struck 9, its chimes carrying across the roofs. Somewhere in Gasworks Lane, a bicycle chain snapped under the pressure of a restless hand. And in the police station, Inspector Purbright poured himself another lukewarm cup of tea, as though time were on his side and the town had nowhere else to be. The following morning dawned with a pale, unconvincing light, the kind that left Flaxborough unsure whether it was worth polishing itself for the day. Clouds hung like indecisive laundry, and the pavements carried the dampness of gossip left out overnight. Inspector Purbright, however, was already at his desk, contemplating the peculiar persistence of the handbag. He had written out, with characteristic neatness, the questions that hung in the air like unclaimed coats. Chief among them was one that required no rhetorical flourish. If Vesper Quillam had indeed been buried in February, who had left her belongings in the station waiting room 6 months later? And why? Sergeant Maltravers entered with his usual air of someone determined to apply order to untidy existence. He carried a thin file which, by Flaxborough standards, meant the matter had already outgrown triviality. "Report from the graveyard keeper, sir," he said. "Checked the Quillam plot this morning. Stone in place, ground undisturbed. Nothing to suggest interference." Purbright accepted the file, leafed through it and murmured, "Which tells us nothing except that graves can be secretive." He set it aside. "Has Leonard been seen this morning?" "Yes, sir. According to Constable Maltby, he was in the market square buying fish. Kippers. Looked as though he hadn't slept." Purbright reflected. "Few people do, after an interview with the police." He smiled faintly, then rose. "I think, Maltravers, we should look in on the Quillam household, the late Vesper's former residence. A house, even when its owner has gone, tends to keep its habits longer than its furniture." The Quillam house lay at the far edge of town, near the river where the fog clung more stubbornly than the local taxes. It was a modest terrace with peeling paint and curtains that drooped as though embarrassed by their own longevity. Mrs Bellamy's voice could be heard in the minds of both men. A widow's dwelling, practical but never cheerful. They knocked. After a moment, a woman answered, grey hair pinned haphazardly, apron blotched with a history of several meals. She identified herself as Mrs Pratt, a neighbour who had been asked to keep an eye on the place. "Family?" Purbright inquired. "None local, Inspector. Leonard comes by sometimes, but he doesn't live here. It's been empty since the funeral. I air it when I can, though it still smells of mothballs and lavender." She lowered her voice, conspiratorial. "And sometimes, though you'll think me daft, I'd swear I heard steps upstairs. But when I looked, nothing." Purbright's expression remained politely blank. He asked if they might have a look inside. The house was a museum of widowhood. The parlour bore a gas fire that had never quite worked, doilies crocheted with resigned devotion, and a photograph of Vesper's late husband staring down from above the mantel as if determined to keep an eye on eternity. A faint dust coated everything, though not uniformly. Purbright ran a finger along the arm of a chair and found it recently disturbed. "Someone's been here," he remarked quietly. Mrs Pratt shook her head. "Not me, Inspector. I dust when I can, but I don't move things." In the bedroom, the wardrobe stood partly open, and on its shelf lay a small box of odds and ends. Inside, a few envelopes, old receipts, and a set of house keys on a ring. More interesting was a small scrap of paper, torn from a notebook with hurried writing. "Station, 10:15. Bring ticket." Purbright studied it with the air of a man considering whether the world had presented him with a clue or merely a distraction. "This," he said mildly, "suggests a meeting." "But with whom?" Maltravers frowned. "Could Leonard have written it?" "Possibly, but Leonard does not strike me as the type to leave notes for himself. His head seems cluttered enough without written encouragement." They left the house, thanked Mrs Pratt, and walked back toward the centre of town. Purbright's silence during the walk was the kind that contained not absence of thought, but an excess of it. That afternoon, Councillor Chubb appeared at the police station, radiating the solemn excitement of a man who had material to impart. He leaned over Purbright's desk, lowering his voice despite the room being otherwise empty. "Inspector, I've heard something. From my barber, actually. He swears that last Tuesday he saw a woman in a black veil walking along Market Street, tall, upright, carrying a handbag. Said she reminded him strongly of Mrs Quillam. Purbright looked up. Last Tuesday? Yes, and what's more, he insists she looked straight at him, then turned down the lane by the post office and disappeared. Did he follow her? Purbright asked gently. Certainly not. He had my sideburns half finished at the time. Purbright nodded. Very wise. The councillor puffed out his chest, gratified to have contributed. Thought, you'd want to know, Inspector. I'd say we must consider the possibility of mistaken identity, or, and here his voice dropped to a whisper, the possibility she was not dead at all. When Chubb had gone, Purbright sat back and allowed himself the faintest smile. The barber's eye, he murmured, sharp as a razor in everything except truth. Yet the report could not be dismissed entirely. Too many threads were tangling, the pawned ring, the handbag, the note, and now the sighting. Flaxborough, it seemed, was building itself a ghost. The following day brought a fresh complication. P.C. Maltby, dutiful if somewhat literal, had interviewed the pawnbroker again and returned with more precise details. The ring pawned under the name Quillam bore an inscription, "To V, with all my love." R.Q.R.Q., Maltby asked, bewildered. That would be her husband, wouldn't it? Most likely, said Purbright. Richard Quillam, the boat builder. Dead these 20 years. Then how? Purbright raised a hand. Yes, that is the difficulty, isn't it? Maltby scowled. So the ring buried with her in February has somehow resurfaced in Blenkinsop's pawnshop. Unless, Purbright said softly, the ring buried was not the ring pawned, and unless the woman buried was not quite the widow we thought. By evening, speculation had congealed into a single popular theory, that Vesper Quillam had staged her death, with or without the help of Leonard, and had now returned to reclaim her place, or perhaps her property. Mrs Bellamy recounted this theory to anyone willing to listen over sausage rolls, while the Spaulding sisters embroidered it into something involving secret marriages and continental lovers. For the police, however, the matter required more than embroidery. Purbright decided to pay Leonard another visit, this time with deliberate timing. He arrived at Gasworks Lane just as Leonard was returning from work, if the odd jobs he claimed counted as such. Leonard looked startled, then resentful, at the inspector's presence. Evening, Purbright said pleasantly. Might I step inside a moment? The small lodgings were cluttered, smelling faintly of tobacco and engine oil. Purbright sat while Leonard fidgeted with a packet of cigarettes he never lit. You pawned a ring, Leonard, Purbright said conversationally. A ring that should not exist outside a grave. Leonard's hand trembled. I needed money. It was my aunt's, yes, but I swear I didn't steal it from her grave. She gave it to me. Purbright tilted his head. When? Leonard's eyes darted. Before she died, just before. She said she didn't want it buried. Said it was wasted under stone. A very practical sentiment, Purbright observed. And when precisely did she give it to you? Leonard hesitated. The night before the funeral. Purbright regarded him kindly, as though encouraging a pupil who had gone astray. That is awkward, Leonard, because by the night before the funeral, she had already been dead 3 days. Leonard paled, his lips forming words he dared not say. He dropped the cigarette packet, stooped to pick it up, and muttered something inaudible. Purbright rose, nodded politely, and said, Thank you for your time. He left the young man trembling in his chair, a figure trapped between lies and truths too heavy to carry. Back at the station, Purbright entered his notes with calm precision. Leonard was lying, that much was clear. But the question was not merely what he concealed, but why. If he had pawned the ring, he risked exposure. Yet he had done it, That suggested desperation, or perhaps a larger arrangement he could not refuse. As Purbright set down his pen, Maltravers entered with another tidbit. "Sir, one of the railway clerks swears he saw Leonard on the morning the handbag was found. Near the station. He seemed to be waiting for someone." Purbright closed his notebook, his eyes narrowing very slightly. "Then perhaps," he murmured, "our first suspect is no longer quite so obvious as the town would like." Outside, Flaxborough prepared itself for evening with its usual blend of resignation and curiosity. Lamps flickered on in shop windows, the Angel Inn began to hum with theories, and somewhere in Gasworks Lane, Leonard Quillam sat staring at his hands as though they no longer quite belonged to him. And Inspector Purbright, sitting alone in his office, allowed himself one last thought before the night closed in. In Flaxborough, nothing ever truly vanished. Not handbags, not rings, and not even widows. They merely waited to be noticed again. Inspector Purbright had a way of letting time perform half the interrogation. He believed that lies, like damp wallpaper, began to peel if one simply waited in the right draft. The matter of Leonard Quillam and his unfortunate entanglement with a dead aunt's handbag was already softening at the edges, and Purbright, who knew better than to push, turned his attention to something smaller. That morning, as he walked the short distance from the police station to the railway offices, the town was performing its usual pantomime of purpose. The fishmonger called out prices in a voice that implied divine authority. The postmistress clucked at a stack of envelopes as though they had misbehaved, and schoolchildren trailed along in pairs, practicing the lifelong art of suspicion. Flaxborough never hurried, but it never forgot either. Everyone knew of the handbag now, and everyone was prepared to attach significance to anything remotely black, beaded, or widow-like. At the station, Mr. Drabble, the station master, greeted Purbright with an eagerness that suggested the place had been aching for official recognition. He laid out a ledger with the reverence of a curate handling scripture. "Inspector, we've checked all tickets sold on the morning in question. No one by the name of Quillam purchased a ticket here." He tapped a finger at the neat columns. "But," Purbright raised his brows, "but we did sell a return to Skegness, Inspector. One purchased with cash. Not unusual, of course, but the buyer, according to Porter Vince, was not a widow at all. It was a young man wearing a hat pulled down low. He asked for it just after 9 o'clock. Purbright studied the entry in the ledger, then looked up with a mild smile. "And he handed over a ticket in a widow's handbag, which was then left in the gentleman's waiting room?" "Just so." It was a trivial but odd detail, one that would have been easily dismissed by anyone less accustomed to the peculiar logic of Flaxborough. For what purpose would a young man buy a widow's day return and then abandon the return half in a handbag known to belong to a woman long buried? Purbright found it useful to ask questions not because they yielded answers, but because they unsettled certainties. As he left the station, Purbright paused at the bookstall. Mr. Packwood, who ran it with the devotion of a man keeping the flame of literature alive in a town determined to ignore it, was rearranging magazines. "Inspector," he said, lowering his voice, "odd business, this Quillam woman. Do you know, 2 days ago someone bought a railway guide here. Bradshaw's, 1965 edition. Paid cash. Young chap, nervous. Couldn't take his eyes off the Skegness timetable. I thought it peculiar at the time. Now, with all this talk—" "Thank you, Mr. Packwood," said Purbright, with the kind of politeness that both closed and opened doors. "Railway guides are not in themselves suspicious. But the timing, yes, most curious." He strolled back toward the high street, turning over the detail in his mind. A day returned to Skegness, unused, found in a handbag belonging to a widow long dead. Purchased not by a widow, but by a nervous young man. And a Bradshaw's railway guide, also newly acquired. It seemed that someone was going to considerable trouble to suggest that Vesper Quillam had taken a journey she could not possibly have made. That evening, Purbright invited Sergeant Maltravers and Constable Maltby into his office for a discussion. He poured tea with the resigned air of a man distributing medicine that was both necessary and distasteful. "Consider the matter," he said, seating himself behind his desk. "We have the bag, the ticket, the ring, and the nephew. What do they tell us?" Maltby, earnest as always, leaned forward. "That Leonard is guilty, sir." "Of what?" Purbright asked, his tone patient. "Well, of something. He lied about the ring. He was seen near the station. He must be involved." Purbright nodded slightly. "Involved, yes. But involvement does not equal guilt of the larger mystery. Leonard may be a tool, not the hand that wields it." Maltravers cleared his throat. "You think someone else is planting these things, sir, to make it look as if Vesper is still alive?" "Possibly," said Purbright, "or to make it look as though she has returned. People do not vanish or reappear without purpose. The question is, whose purpose?" The sergeant frowned. "But why Skegness?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Why indeed? Few places invite both escape and ridicule quite so neatly." The next day, Purbright made a deliberate detour through the market square. He stopped at a greengrocer's stall, examined some apples with apparent interest, and listened. The Spaulding sisters were in full chorus nearby, telling a tale of how they had seen Vesper herself on the promenade at Skegness, accompanied by a gentleman in a bowler hat. The gentleman, they insisted, had been laughing too much for decency. Purbright turned an apple over in his hand, murmured something about blemishes, and let the gossip sink into his thoughts. Sightings of widows long dead had a way of multiplying. They were less about evidence than about hunger, for scandal, for explanation, for meaning. Still, he could not dismiss the oddness of the train ticket and the handbag. A hoax, perhaps, or a message meant for someone specific. That afternoon, he called upon the vicar, Reverend Draycott, who had conducted Vesper's funeral. The Reverend was a gentleman, prone to woolly reflections, and his study smelled of pipe smoke and stale biscuits. "Inspector," he said, "I remember the funeral well. Cold, snowy, the kind of day when one feels that eternity is more draught than promise. Mrs. Quillam lay in her coffin, veiled even then. I cannot say I saw her face clearly. Protocol and respect forbade it, but the body was identified by family. Leonard, chiefly. He insisted it was her." "Insisted?" Purbright repeated softly. "Yes. In fact, he seemed oddly eager, almost hurried. But grief takes many forms, Inspector." Purbright left the vicarage with a thought that was less comforting than the Reverend's theology. If Leonard had insisted upon the identification, then Leonard's honesty, or lack of it, lay at the heart of the burial. Was it possible that Vesper Quillam had never been in that coffin at all? Yet there was another detail, small and odd, that tugged at Purbright's mind like a child at his sleeve. The pawn ticket, a ring given by a husband long dead, supposedly buried with Vesper, yet pawned weeks ago. It suggested not merely deceit, but substitution. That evening, as the lamps lit across town, Purbright walked slowly along the riverbank, considering the nature of deceit in Flaxborough. People rarely lied for grand reasons. They lied for comfort, for convenience, for pennies, or for love. Grand conspiracies were unnecessary. Petty needs explained almost everything. And yet, someone had gone to considerable lengths to create the illusion of a widow returning from the grave. That was not petty. That was purposeful. At the police station, a message awaited him. Mrs. Reeve, the vicar's wife, had sent word. She wished to speak to him urgently. He called upon her at once. She met him at the door, anxious. "Inspector, I've remembered something. At the funeral, after the service." I went back into the church to collect the hymn books. The coffin was there, ready to be carried out, and I thought I heard a sound, a faint one, like a sigh. I told myself it was wind through the rafters, but now, with all this talk, I can't be sure. Purbright listened without expression, but inside he felt the small weight of the odd detail grow heavier. A sigh, a coffin, a body no one had seen clearly, and a nephew insisting upon the identification. He thanked Mrs. Reeve, reassured her with gentle courtesy, and left. The night was cool, the stars hidden. Flaxborough's streets lay quiet, but the silence seemed to hum with possibilities. Purbright walked back to the station, his mind arranging the pieces: the ticket, the handbag, the pawned ring, Leonard's lies, the Reverend's recollection, Mrs. Reeve's unease. Each was a trivial thing, but together they formed a pattern too deliberate to ignore. Someone had played a game with death and appearances. Someone had staged a performance and left just enough props lying around for an audience to notice. When he sat again at his desk, Purbright wrote a single line in his notebook: "If the dead did not return, then perhaps they never left." He closed the book, set it aside, and allowed himself the luxury of stillness. Suspense, after all, was best cultivated quietly. And in Flaxborough, the quiet was never as innocent as it seemed. The next morning brought a watery sun, and the feeling that Flaxborough, though unchanged, was beginning to watch itself with suspicion. Even the lamp-posts appeared to lean in closer to hear the latest. A handbag left in the station, a ticket unused, a ring pawned, and whispers of a widow both buried and sighted. These things had taken root in the town's imagination. And as Purbright knew well, once imagination had been stirred, every household offered its own supply of fertilizer. By mid-morning, rumours had grown into hardy shrubs. In the Angel Inn, Mr. Blenkinsop the pawnbroker was already the villain of one version, having supposedly dug up graves for profit. In another, the Quillam family had been hiding a secret twin sister, a Mrs. Vesper Quillam, whose sudden reappearance had confused everyone into thinking Vesper had returned from the dead. The Spaulding sisters favoured this twin theory, though they embellished it with talk of forbidden romances. Inspector Purbright, however, was interested less in twins than in truths. He knew it was time to expand the field of inquiry. One must, he often thought, let the town talk itself tired. In that exhaustion, useful fragments dropped like coins from an overstuffed purse. He began with Mrs. Dawes, Leonard's landlady. She was a lean woman with an expression carved from vinegar, and her parlour smelled of onions and reproach. "I won't say he's a bad lodger," she told Purbright, perched on the edge of her chair like a cat preparing to spring. "But he is a secretive one, keeps odd hours, comes in past midnight some nights, leaves scraps of paper about with writing on them. I tidy, of course. I won't have my place looking like a station office. But sometimes I can't help but read." "Do share, Mrs. Dawes," said Purbright mildly, as though she were confiding the weather. One note said, "Friday, bridge 8:30. Another, scribbled on the back of a bus ticket, just had 2 words, "Black Veil." That chilled me, Inspector. I don't mind telling you. "Very sensible," murmured Purbright. "Did you ever see who he met?" Mrs. Dawes pursed her lips. "Only once. A woman outside, late evening. Couldn't see her face, but she wore a dark veil, I'll swear to it." Purbright thanked her, making no visible note, though in his mind the fragments arranged themselves with quiet insistence. A black veil, a meeting, and Leonard at the centre. Yet who played the other part? From Mrs. Dawes, Purbright moved on to Mr. Blenkinsop, who, though already visited, had more to say. Pawnbrokers were like church confessionals, return often enough, and the truth trickled out in installments. "Inspector," he said, leaning over his counter, "you asked about the ring. Well, I've remembered another thing. When the young man, Leonard, brought it in, He kept glancing over his shoulder as if someone had sent him, and when I counted out the money, he muttered, "She'll not wait." "She?" Purbright repeated softly. "That's what I heard." Purbright inclined his head, thanked the pawnbroker, and left him to polish watches that no longer told time. It was the small detail, "She'll not wait," that tugged again. If Leonard had pawned the ring for someone else, then that person, perhaps veiled, perhaps alive or pretending to be, was exerting some authority over him. By the following afternoon, the investigation had widened further. The police station received a visit from Miss Tarrant, a schoolteacher whose sense of civic duty was only matched by her appetite for narrative. She claimed that 3 nights ago she had seen a figure moving through the churchyard, dressed in black and carrying something that glinted in the moonlight. "Could it have been a spade?" Maltby asked hopefully. "Or a handbag," she replied firmly. "I teach composition, Constable. I know how to observe." Purbright thanked her gravely, though he regarded her testimony with his usual caution. People often mistook shadows for stories. Still, every story carried a grain that, under enough scrutiny, could turn to stone. The following day, the circle widened again. Councillor Chubb arrived with what he clearly thought was a masterstroke. He had spoken to the sexton, a man named Clue, who had let slip that on the morning of Vesper's burial the coffin had been surprisingly light. "Light, Inspector, what do you make of that?" "That the undertaker may have economized on wood," Purbright said gently. Chubb coloured, but pressed on. "Or that it contained less than was expected." Purbright did not contradict him, but in his notebook he drew a small mark beside Clue's name. Sextons, like pawnbrokers, were often better witnesses than they realized. Later, as dusk came down like a tired curtain, Purbright took a slow walk to the riverbank where the old boatyard once stood. Richard Quillam, Vesper's late husband, had built boats there before his fatal fall from a ladder. The yard was now derelict, its sheds leaning at odd angles, but locals still avoided it after dark. Here he encountered Mr. Fenby, a retired boatman with a face like weathered oak. "Evening, Inspector," he said, tugging at his cap. "You'll be after that Quillam business, I reckon." "I am," said Purbright quietly. Fenby nodded toward the sheds. "I seen lights in there, 2 nights ago. Lantern, moving about, and I heard voices. Man's and woman's both. Couldn't catch the words, but they weren't arguing. More like planning." "Planning what, Mr. Fenby?" The old man shrugged. "Couldn't say. But it set me thinking. Folks reckon the dead rest quiet. I say some don't lie easy." Purbright left him to his thoughts, but carried the detail with him. Lights in the boatyard, voices, a woman's presence. Slowly, the image of a wider scheme began to take shape. Leonard, pressured into pawning a ring. A woman in a black veil, glimpsed by multiple townsfolk. A series of carefully planted details suggesting that Vesper Quillam had returned from the grave. At the police station that night, Maltravers suggested bluntly that they arrest Leonard at once. "On what charge?" Purbright asked, with mild amusement. "Deception, sir. Fraud. Something." Purbright shook his head. "Leonard is useful only so long as he believes he is not yet cornered. To frighten him now would be to scatter the crumbs before we know where they lead. Let him feel watched, but not captured." Maltravers looked unconvinced, but nodded. He had long ago accepted that Purbright's patience was a weapon more effective than handcuffs. And so the inspector let the town continue its fevered invention, each new voice widening the field. A schoolteacher with her moonlit figure, a councillor with his light coffin, an old boatman with his lanterns, a landlady with her veiled visitor. Together, they formed a chorus of half-truths, each contributing to a mystery larger than itself. One evening, when the Angel Inn was loudest with theories, Purbright sat quietly at a corner table, nursing a half-pint. He listened as townsfolk debated, argued, embellished. Some swore they had seen Vesper in town. Others claimed she had been spirited away to the continent. One man insisted she had, never died at all, but had fled to avoid creditors. Purbright smiled faintly, as if entertained. He let them talk, let the field expand around him. Because he knew that somewhere among all this invention, one careless truth would slip out, dropped not by schemers, but by ordinary people, too eager to be part of the story. When at last he rose to leave, he did so with his usual unhurried air, but in his pocket lay a note scribbled on a bar napkin, passed to him by the innkeeper's wife with a whisper. "Ask about the woman at the boatyard. She calls herself Vesper." Purbright walked into the night, the town settling around him like a restless sleeper. The field had widened indeed, and somewhere in it moved a woman, alive or not, who had chosen to wear a dead widow's name like a veil. Even for Flaxborough, whose appetite for unlikely tales was as steady as its diet of sausage rolls, the matter of Vesper Quillam had begun to acquire a density that threatened to overwhelm the town's capacity for gossip. The handbag in the station, the pawned ring, Leonard's evasions, and whispers of a woman seen in veil and black, all these had swirled together until no conversation in shop, church, or pub was innocent of speculation. Yet it was not until the second incident occurred that the whole affair began to feel less like a game of imagination and more like something with claws. It happened on a Thursday evening, when the air had grown thick with the scent of cabbages from allotments and the river, swollen by recent rains, dragged at its banks with a resentful suck. A boy from the Crescent, fishing where he ought not to have been, ran home shouting that he had pulled something dreadful from the water. His mother, convinced this was a tale meant to excuse a lost line, sent him to bed with a slippered threat. But the boy, persistent and shrill, dragged her back to the river bank, where indeed there lay, entangled in reeds, the sodden bulk of a coffin lid. By the time word reached the police station, half the neighborhood had assembled. The lid, waterlogged and pallid, bore the marks of a coffin plate crudely removed. No name, no date, just the impression of where brass once had been. Purbright arrived with Constable Maltby, his expression one of mild curiosity, as though someone had shown him an unusual fungus. He inspected the wood, ran a finger over the gouged area, and murmured, "Graves do not usually dismantle themselves." The crowd pressed in. Someone asked, too loudly, whether this meant Vesper had clawed her way out. Someone else swore they had heard a woman weeping by the river the previous night. "Best take it to the station," Purbright said quietly to Maltby. "Treat it with courtesy. It has travelled." The lid was carted away on a hand-barrow, accompanied by a murmuring crowd that made the journey feel less like a police matter than a funeral in reverse. Back at the station, Sergeant Maltravers regarded the thing with suspicion, as though it might confess at any moment. "From the Quillam grave, sir?" "Perhaps," Purbright said, "though one must be cautious about assigning family names to flotsam. Still, it is suggestive, is it not?" By morning, the vicarage was in uproar. Reverend Draycott, pale with indignation, arrived at Purbright's office, clutching his cassock as though it were evidence. "Inspector, this is sacrilege," he exclaimed. "To disturb a Christian burial, to cast holy ground into the river, why, it undermines the very stability of the parish." "Indeed," Purbright said mildly, "and very inconvenient for the deceased as well." The Reverend blinked, then continued with righteous fervour. "The coffin plate removed, you say? Deliberate tampering. This was not the work of the elements. Someone has sought to make us doubt whether the body of Mrs. Quillam rests where it ought. I cannot permit the parish to be unsettled by such theatrics." "Quite," said Purbright. "Theatrics is the word." When the vicar had been soothed with tea, Purbright turned to practicalities. He sent Maltby and a pair of men to the graveyard to inspect Vesper Quillam's plot directly. By noon they returned, breathless, with their report. The grave had indeed been tampered with. Earth disturbed, the coffin prized open, and the interior, though they had not dared to meddle much, appeared lacking in anything one might expect from a deceased widow. Purbright received the news without so much as an arched brow. "So," he murmured, "our widow, whose handbag travelled further than her return ticket, has now travelled further than her coffin." Curious symmetry. The town, of course, required no official announcement. News of the desecration spread by means of milkmen, postmen, and the sheer volume of voices in the Angel Inn. By evening, the story was no longer about a missing widow, but about a resurrection. Children refused to pass the graveyard after dusk. Old women swore they heard footsteps in their passages, and Leonard Quillam, poor unfortunate, became both suspect and scapegoat. Purbright paid him another visit. Leonard, gaunt-eyed and trembling, swore he knew nothing of the grave. "I never touched it, Inspector. God strike me if I did. I wanted nothing to do with it. She's gone, that's all." "Gone? Gone where, Leonard?" Purbright asked softly. The young man clutched his head. "I don't know. I only did what she told me. She gave me the ring, told me to pawn it, said she needed the money. But she's dead, isn't she?" "She must be." His words tangled themselves in fear. "Who told you she was alive?" Purbright inquired. Leonard's eyes darted wildly. He opened his mouth, shut it, then whispered, "I can't say. She'll hear of it." Purbright leaned forward. "She?" But Leonard buried his face in his hands and would not answer. Later, back at the station, Maltravers argued forcefully that Leonard should be detained at once. "It's clear, sir. He knows more than he admits. He may have helped remove the body. At the very least, he's obstructing." Purbright considered. "Leonard is frightened, yes, but frightened men sometimes serve best as lures. Let us not frighten him into silence. Let us, instead, wait for the one who terrifies him to reveal herself." And so Flaxborough simmered. Each day brought fresh tales, a figure glimpsed by the canal, a voice in the boatyard, a light in the Quillam house long after dark. The second incident, the coffin lid, had transformed a curious puzzle into a matter tinged with menace. No longer was it merely gossip. Now there was fear. The undertaker, Mr. Sleet, visited Purbright to deny any professional failing. "The coffin was sound, Inspector. Oak, tight-sealed. Proper plate. If it's open now, it's because someone prized it. And I'll not have my workmanship questioned by idle tongues." Purbright soothed him, noting quietly how quick the man was to insist. Too quick, perhaps. Meanwhile, Mrs. Dawes, Leonard's landlady, reported that her lodger had not slept for 3 nights, rising to pace his room until dawn. "And once," she whispered, "I heard him talking to someone." Low voice, pleading. But when I went to listen at the door, there was no answer but his own. All the while, Purbright gathered these fragments with his usual calm. He knew that truth was rarely dramatic at the outset. It appeared instead in the way a man avoided a question, the tremor in a voice, the oddness of a small detail, like a return half unpunched. One evening, just as the Angel Inn was brimming with speculation, a note arrived at the station, delivered by a child who claimed only that a lady had given it to him near the market. The paper was plain, the handwriting brisk. "Inspector Purbright. Stop looking for Vesper Quillam. She's not yours to find. If you continue, others will be disturbed. Leave her to rest where she is." Purbright read it twice, folded it neatly, and placed it in his notebook. "Interesting," he murmured, "that one must write about resting when one does not, oneself, rest easy." He dismissed the boy with a coin, thanked him for his service, and sat in silence for some time. The second incident, the coffin lid, the empty grave, had made one thing clear. Someone in Flaxborough wanted the town to believe that Vesper Quillam was neither dead nor alive, but something in between, a presence unsettled, a ghost that haunted. And behind that ghost, hidden carefully, was a living hand arranging the props. The question now was whose hand and whose purpose. That night, Purbright wrote one sentence in his neat, restrained hand. The grave was not robbed for treasure, but for story. He underlined the last word once, firmly, then closed the book. Outside, the wind rose against the rooftops, carrying with it the uneasy whisper of a town that no longer trusted its own shadows. And Inspector Purbright, patient as always, waited for the shadows to speak. Inspector Purbright was never a man to rush at mysteries like a terrier at a rabbit hole. He preferred, instead, to sit back and watch the grass, confident that sooner or later the rabbit would shift, betray itself, and make the chase unnecessary. After the discovery of the coffin lid and the confirmation that Vesper Quillam's grave was, at the very least, unreliable, the town was abuzz with theories that ranged from scandal to the supernatural. But Purbright did not join the clamour. He let it run its course, for he understood something most of Flaxborough did not. Panic was never the voice of truth. In the quiet of his office, he permitted himself the luxury of reflection. It was an old-fashioned room, lined with files whose labels had yellowed, the faint smell of pipe smoke clinging to the air like a parishioner reluctant to leave after a sermon. Purbright leaned back, hands steepled, eyes half closed. He thought about Leonard Quillam, so nervous, so transparently inadequate as a villain. If Leonard had meddled with his aunt's memory, it was not by his own design. He was too easily frightened, too loose in his lies. Someone was pulling at him, tightening strings he scarcely understood, and that someone had sense enough to make use of the town's appetite for drama. The empty coffin was not, Purbright decided, meant to remove a body. It was meant to create a story calculated to stir whispers, to keep Flaxborough off balance, to generate exactly the kind of confusion now choking its streets. Why? Because confusion was fertile soil. It covered tracks, it distracted, it left space for quieter, more profitable maneuvers. He tapped his pen against the desk, a sound muffled by thought. People in towns like this rarely acted out of grand design. They lied, cheated, or pretended not because of malice, but because of habit. A lie kept a family reputation tidy. A theft was often less about gain than about preserving appearances. In such places, the weight of what people would say was heavier than any gravestone. Vesper herself had been a woman of habits. The veil worn for decades beyond its fashion, the regular seat at church, the carefully polished handbag, the reputation of mourning performed as vocation. People like her did not easily vanish. They left grooves in the community. The handbag, found so pointedly in the gentleman's waiting room, had been no accident. It was bait, or more precisely, theatre. He considered the detail Mrs. Reeve had confided. The sigh at the funeral. He considered the pawnbroker's remark, Leonard muttering, "She'll not wait." He considered the boatman's report of voices at the derelict yard. Small things, each inconclusive, but together they formed an outline, faint yet insistent. Someone, alive, determined, and not entirely scrupulous, was wearing Vesper's absence as a mask. Purbright allowed himself a half smile. Theatrical indeed. And as with all theatre, the most revealing clue was not on stage, but in the wings. Who benefited from this elaborate illusion? Who gained from making Flaxborough believe in a widow risen from the grave? He thought of the pawn ticket, a ring pawned for money. Someone was in need. Not Leonard, his desperation was too clumsy. No, someone else. Someone who could frighten Leonard into obedience. Someone who knew the value of a story as well as the value of a ring. Maltravers knocked and entered, bringing tea. The sergeant's face was tense, his tone brisk. "Sir, people are unsettled. Some are saying we should guard the graveyard. They're talking of witches. Ghosts. Nonsense, but it's spreading." "Witches," Purbright repeated mildly. Flaxborough has never lacked for imagination. He sipped his tea. "But tell me, Maltravers, Why do people prefer to believe in ghosts rather than in thieves? The sergeant frowned. I suppose because thieves are their neighbours, sir. Exactly. Purbright's eyes gleamed faintly. And neighbours are harder to exorcise. That night, walking home through the high street, Purbright paused to watch the town in its natural element. Couples passed with hurried glances, eager to be indoors. The Spalding sisters, shawls drawn tight, crossed themselves when a cat darted into the shadows. At the Angel Inn, the laughter was too loud, the conversation too fast, people talking against their own unease. He turned into a quieter lane, where the houses leaned inward as though gossiping over the cobbles. He let his mind settle on the widow herself. Vesper Quillam had been no saint. Purbright recalled subtle tales of debts, of quarrels with neighbours, of small cruelties wrapped in lace. Her reputation for piety had been mixed with a streak of vanity, the dye for her hair, the fuss over her veil. A woman like that might inspire both loyalty and resentment. Enough resentment, perhaps, to make her death useful. Enough loyalty or fear to make her memory dangerous. The next morning, Purbright summoned Constable Maltby. Walk the market square. Listen, don't question. Pay attention to who avoids the subject of Vesper. Silence can be louder than speech. By noon, Maltby returned, flustered but eager. Sir, I noticed something. Mrs. Dawes, you know, Leonard's landlady, was all too ready to discuss Vesper. But when I mentioned the boatyard, she went quiet, stiff as a post. Said she didn't know the place. Everyone in town knows the boatyard. Good, Purbright said simply. Maltby blinked. Good, sir. Because silence is the first honest thing we've heard. Left alone again, Purbright mused on Mrs. Dawes, a woman of vinegar and economy, sharp enough to cut corners. Why should she deny knowledge of the boatyard? Unless she had reason to fear it being mentioned. Perhaps she had been there. Perhaps she had met the veiled woman there. Perhaps she herself was the veiled woman. He leaned back, fingers folded across his waistcoat, and let the thought settle. Mrs. Dawes had motive. She wanted money. She had opportunity. She lodged the hapless Leonard. She had the temperament, resentful, cunning, thrifty enough to pawn a dead woman's ring. And she had the wit to play upon the town's appetite for drama. A handbag here, a sigh there, a coffin lid set afloat, all calculated not to hide, but to distract. The picture grew sharper, though Purbright, as ever, allowed no trace of triumph to cross his face. Truth, he knew, was fragile. It bruised easily under the weight of certainty. Better to keep it folded, like a handkerchief in a widow's bag, until the moment came to draw it out. That evening, in his notebook, he wrote a short line in his small, steady hand. Stories of ghosts conceal the hungers of the living. He underlined hungers once, then closed the book. The town outside continued its restless whispering, but Purbright, alone in his office, remained calm. He had no need to chase the rabbit. It was already stirring, and when it emerged, he would be waiting, as patient as ever. Purbright had always regarded truth as a shy bird. Chase it too directly, and it fluttered off into thickets. Stand still, however, and it might come near of its own accord. The matter of Vesper Quillam had now reached a stage where the town had frightened itself into a kind of paralysis. People whispering in corners, refusing to pass the churchyard, even suggesting to the vicar that holy water might be sprinkled across the market square. All of which suited Purbright well. Fear ripened people. It made them careless with their secrets. But he judged the time was ripe for a small, deliberate prod. A test of sorts. Something polite, seemingly casual, yet crafted to stir the guilty into betraying themselves. He chose his setting carefully. The Thursday evening parish committee meeting at St. Luke's Hall. These gatherings were Flaxborough's version of Parliament. Endless speeches about bun sales and hymn book repairs, but also the perfect venue for gossip disguised as civic duty. Most of the figures entangled in the Quillam affair would be there, each eager to see how others reacted to the widow's ghostly revival. The hall smelt of damp coats and sponge cake. Mrs. Reeve presided with brisk efficiency, while Councillor Chubb beamed at the prospect of displaying his rhetoric. Leonard Quillam sat awkwardly at the back, dragged there by his landlady, Mrs. Dawes, who looked sourly determined to prove her own innocence by visible attendance. Mr. Blenkinsop, the pawnbroker, hovered like a man expecting to be accused of theft, while Mr. Fenby, the retired boatman, had come only because he suspected there might be sherry. Purbright sat quietly among them, a figure of courtesy rather than command. He allowed the meeting to ramble through its usual motions. The leaking roof, the dwindling choir funds, the scandal of hymnals going, missing. He waited until attention had begun to wander. Then, with the gentlest clearing of his throat, he spoke. "I wonder," he said mildly, "if any of you noticed the curious matter at the graveyard." Heads turned. The room stiffened. Leonard looked at the floor. Mrs. Dawes's hand tightened on her handbag until the leather squeaked. Purbright continued, his tone conversational, as if remarking upon the weather. "It appears that Mrs. Quillam's coffin has been tampered with. Quite an inconvenience, I dare say, for one expecting eternal rest, though perhaps not so inconvenient if one had never intended to rest there in the first place." A ripple ran through the hall. The vicar muttered about sacrilege. Chubb coughed into his hand as though applauding, but Purbright was watching faces, not hearing words. He saw Mrs. Dawes glance sharply at Leonard, a look that contained more threat than sympathy. He saw Leonard flinch. He saw Blenkinsop's eyes widen with sudden recollection, then drop guiltily. Purbright smiled faintly. "Of course," he went on, "the matter could be explained by any number of innocent causes. A coffin plate loosened, earth disturbed, a river carrying away a stray lid. Still, it does make one think. Who among us might benefit from Mrs. Quillam's absence? Or, shall we say, her surprising reappearance?" Silence followed. The kind of silence in which people's thoughts grow too loud for comfort. Mrs. Dawes broke it with brittle briskness. "Superstitious nonsense. The dead are dead. It's mischief, that's all. Youths or drunkards." Her voice was steady, but her hands betrayed her. Fingers twitching at the clasp of her handbag, eyes flickering sideways to see if anyone doubted her. Purbright inclined his head. "Indeed, Mrs. Dawes, mischief is often a mask for something else." After the meeting, as chairs scraped and people muttered their way out into the night, Purbright lingered near the door. He watched as Leonard and Mrs. Dawes left together. She gripped his arm, speaking to him in low, urgent tones. Leonard nodded miserably, his shoulders hunched. The inspector did not intervene. His test had done its work. He had planted the suggestion of guilt, of suspicion, and now those entangled would begin to squirm. He needed only to watch which way they squirmed. The following day, his patience was rewarded. Mr. Blenkinsop, the pawnbroker, arrived at the station, agitated. "Inspector, I can't keep this to myself any longer. That ring, when Leonard pawned it, he wasn't alone. There was a woman waiting outside, veiled, black-dressed, tall. He handed her the money as soon as he left. I didn't mention it before because I didn't want trouble. But I swear it now." Purbright received the confession with mild courtesy, though inside he noted how neatly it confirmed his suspicions. A woman veiled. A woman who directed Leonard's actions, and a woman who clearly wanted to be seen as Vesper. Quillam returned from the grave. That afternoon, he paid a call on Mrs. Dawes. She received him in her parlour, all starch and suspicion. "Inspector," she said sharply, "I do hope you are not encouraging this nonsense about ghosts. The town is half mad already." "Madness," Purbright said softly, "is often guided by a steady hand." He glanced at her handbag, resting heavily on the side table. Curious thing about handbags. They can carry what one wishes to hide as easily as what one wishes to show. Her eyes narrowed. "Are you accusing me of something, Inspector?" "Merely observing." he replied with infuriating gentleness. That when a woman in a veil instructs a frightened young man to pawn a ring, and when that same young man mutters, "She'll not wait," one begins to wonder whose impatience is driving this theatre. Mrs. Dawes's lips tightened. She said nothing further, but her silence was loud enough to satisfy Purbright for the moment. Back at the station, he shared his reflections with Sergeant Maltravers. "You mean it's Mrs. Dawes, sir?" the sergeant asked, almost disappointed. "All this fuss, and it comes down to a landlady?" "Landladies," Purbright observed, "are often underestimated. They see everything, hear everything, and resent much of it. And some, when presented with opportunity, create theatre grander than any stage." Maltravers frowned. "But why would she bother with all this pretense about Vesper being alive?" Purbright smiled faintly. "Because, Sergeant, the story of a resurrected widow frightens people more thoroughly than any ordinary fraud, and fear is an excellent cloak for other activities. While the town talks of ghosts, no one asks where money has gone, or why rings change hands." That night, Purbright sat alone at his desk, reflecting once more. He thought of the townsfolk, their eagerness to believe in the improbable, their terror of appearances undone. He thought of Leonard, too weak to resist, too bound by fear of the woman who housed him. And he thought of Mrs. Dawes, whose vinegar-sharp presence concealed a hunger greater than thrift, the hunger for control, for power over stories. He allowed himself a long pause, then wrote a line in his notebook. Guilt betrays itself not in words, but in glances shared when no one is meant to notice. He underlined glances once, firmly. The test had worked. The field was narrowing. Soon it would be time to step gently, but decisively, toward the reveal. For now, he waited. In Flaxborough, truth always came. The trick was not to chase it, but to sit, polite and patient, until the shy bird fluttered into one's hand. By the time September's first chill crept into Flaxborough, the town had exhausted itself with talk of Vesper Quillam. It was as if every citizen had wrung the mystery dry and yet could not stop themselves from squeezing again, hoping for one last drop of scandal. Shopkeepers discussed the empty coffin while wrapping butter. Farmers speculated over the handbag as they haggled about pigs. The Spalding sisters stitched new embellishments into their version of events with every passing day. Yet under this surface froth, Purbright knew the true players were beginning to fray. He had set his test in the parish hall. He had seen the flinches, the glances, the brittle silences. Now he watched for the aftershocks. They came quickly. Leonard Quillam began avoiding daylight, his lanky figure seen only late at night, slinking between Gasworks Lane and the old boatyard. Mrs. Dawes, by contrast, became conspicuously visible, bustling about town with an air of forced confidence, speaking loudly against this absurd, haunting business whenever the chance arose. And Blenkinsop, the pawnbroker, poor man, seemed to shrink daily, convinced he had been cast in the role of accomplice by fate itself. Purbright, in his calm way, made no arrests, issued no proclamations. He simply invited each of them into small conversations that appeared friendly, inconsequential, but were calculated to jostle the guilty conscience. One such moment came in the market square, when Purbright stopped beside Mrs. Dawes as she inspected a heap of cabbages. "Healthy crop this year," he remarked mildly. Curious thing about vegetables, though. They show on their surface what's inside. Not so with people. People carry their bruises deep until one presses. Mrs. Dawes glared at him, then dropped a coin onto the stall without buying anything. Another came with Leonard, whom Purbright found loitering near the churchyard gates. The young man jumped at the sight of him. "Evening, Leonard," Purbright said pleasantly. "I've been thinking about your aunt's grave. Odd, isn't it? How some people rest so lightly in their coffins, almost as though they expected to get up and leave again." Leonard stammered, muttered something about needing to be somewhere else, and fled. Purbright let him go. He knew desperation was close when a suspect could not endure even mild irony. That week, a third disturbance confirmed his instincts. At the riverbank, not far from where the coffin lid had been found, a passer-by stumbled upon a small pile of burned papers. Most were ash, but a fragment survived. The corner of a pawn receipt. Blenkinsop's unmistakable letterhead still visible, though the name had been scorched away. Someone was trying to erase traces, clumsily, hurriedly. Purbright examined the fragment in his office, his face as neutral as ever. Then he wrote a note in his book, "They grow afraid of paper. Soon they will grow afraid of each other." His moment of reflection was interrupted by Sergeant Maltravers. "Sir, if I may, this business has gone on too long. The town wants answers. The council wants action. We should arrest Leonard, charge him with disturbing a grave at least." Purbright shook his head. "Arrest Leonard and the play ends too soon, Sergeant. We must let the final act write itself." Maltravers frowned. "Final act?" "Yes," Purbright murmured. "The theatre of Flaxborough demands its curtain. We must only be sure the right performer bows." So he set about arranging his stage. First, he asked the vicar for the use of the vestry one evening. "Private talk with a few parishioners," he explained with his usual gentle courtesy. Then he sent polite invitations, not summonses, but requests difficult to refuse. To Leonard, who turned pale at the very thought. To Mrs. Dawes, who pursed her lips but agreed. To Blenkinsop, who looked as though he had been sentenced. And finally, to Mrs. Reeve, the vicar's wife, who had seen and heard more than most, though she scarcely realized how important her observations had become. On the appointed evening, the vestry lamp cast a warm glow over polished wood and hymnals stacked neatly in corners. Outside, the town settled into its autumn quiet, but within the small chamber the air was taut with unease. Purbright began with impeccable civility. "Thank you all for coming. I thought it best to speak plainly, in private, before matters grow more unruly. There has been much talk about Mrs. Vesper Quillam, about her death, her grave, her belongings turning up in unlikely places. The town is restless, but the truth, I believe, is not supernatural. It is rather more human." Leonard shifted in his chair, his collar damp with sweat. Mrs. Dawes sat stiffly, her handbag clamped to her lap as though it were armor. Blenkinsop wrung his hands. Mrs. Reeve looked from one face to another, puzzled but attentive. Purbright's voice remained calm, almost soothing. "We know the coffin was empty, or nearly so. We know Leonard pawned a ring that should have been buried. We know a handbag belonging to Vesper was left in the station, with a ticket unused. And we know a woman in a veil has been seen, instructing, directing, frightening." He paused, letting the silence stretch until it quivered. Then he added softly, "The question is not whether Vesper lives. The question is who has chosen to wear her absence as a disguise." Leonard let out a strangled sound, half protest, half plea. "It wasn't me. I never meant. I only did what she told me." Mrs. Dawes snapped, "Quiet, boy." But Purbright leaned forward slightly, his eyes kind but unrelenting. "Yes, Leonard. Tell us what she told you." The young man's lips trembled. He looked at Mrs. Dawes, whose eyes burned into him, sharp with warning. Then he dropped his gaze. "She said Vesper wanted the money, that she needed me to pawn the ring, carry the handbag, leave it where it would be found. She said if I didn't, everyone would think I'd stolen from my own aunt's grave." Mrs. Dawes' voice sliced the air. "Lies. He's a weak boy, Inspector, saying anything to please you." Purbright regarded her with his mild smile. "Weak, yes, but weak boys seldom invent entire theatres of ghosts and coffins. That takes a stronger imagination. A landlady's imagination, perhaps." Her knuckles whitened on the handbag. "Are you accusing me of fraud?" "Fraud." Purbright's voice was gentle. "Number something subtler. You wished to frighten the town, to turn attention toward Vesper's supposed return and away from your own dealings. Perhaps you owed money. Perhaps you wanted leverage over Leonard. Perhaps you simply relished the power of directing a story. Mrs. Reeve gasped softly. Blenkinsop muttered a prayer under his breath. Mrs. Dawes rose half from her chair. You can't prove... Purbright raised a hand, still calm. Proof lies not in paper alone, Mrs. Dawes, though the burned pawn receipt speaks loudly enough. It lies in behaviour, in glances exchanged, in silences too sudden, in a woman who shouts down a ghost she claims not to believe in. Leonard whispered, brokenly. She said Vesper was better off dead. That no one cared, so we might as well use her name. The room stilled. Purbright's tone remained as polite as if he were asking for sugar in his tea. There is the truth, then. Not resurrection. Not haunting. Just a living woman who found it convenient to dress herself in the shadow of the dead. Mrs. Dawes collapsed back into her chair, her face drained of colour. She said nothing. Purbright stood, smoothing his coat. The town will hear what it needs to hear, in due course. But here, among us, we may acknowledge the play is over. He turned to Mrs. Reeve. You were right, madam, when you said you heard a sigh at the funeral. But it was not the sigh of a woman rising. It was the sigh of those around her, relieved to believe the coffin contained what they wished it to contain. And it did not. With that, he closed his notebook, nodded courteously, and left them in silence. Outside, the night air was cool, scented faintly of smoke from hearths. Flaxborough lay still as if holding its breath. Purbright walked slowly back to the station, his pace unhurried. He knew the guilty had been unsettled. The web had tightened. There would be paperwork, of course, and statements and the dull mechanics of law. But the mystery itself was nearly spent, and in that knowledge, Inspector Purbright allowed himself the faintest smile. The shy bird had flown straight into his hand. Inspector Purbright had always preferred his revelations to be made in daylight. He believed that truth, like mildew, lost half its menace when exposed to the sun. And so it was on a mild Friday afternoon, with the market square bustling and the town pretending it had better things to do, that he arranged for his explanation. The setting was deliberately ordinary. The committee room at the town hall. It smelt faintly of chalk dust and beeswax, with a clock that ticked like a disapproving aunt. Around the table sat those most directly entangled. Leonard Quillam, pale and twitching. Mrs. Dawes, stiff-backed, her lips pressed into a line of vinegar. Mr. Blenkinsop, the pawnbroker, perspiring under his collar, and Councillor Chubb, invited partly because he had insisted, and partly because Purbright knew his presence would guarantee that every detail was faithfully retailed in the Angel Inn by nightfall. Purbright began without preamble, his voice as calm as if reading out the minutes of a gardening society. Let us start, he said, with a handbag. Left in the gentleman's waiting room, containing a ticket for a journey never made. A curious object, discovered where no widow had business. This handbag belonged to Mrs. Vesper Quillam, deceased in February. So the town believed, but the bag, like the ring pawned, like the coffin emptied, told us something else entirely. Leonard swallowed, his Adam's apple bobbing like a cork. Mrs. Dawes shifted, but said nothing. Purbright continued, his eyes half closed as though thinking aloud. Vesper's funeral was conducted in snow, with a coffin carried by bearers and lowered into earth. Yet few saw the body. She was veiled, identified only by Leonard, who insisted upon it. Convenient for someone eager to bring matters to a tidy close, and convenient for those who wished to use her absence as a tool. Chubb cleared his throat, puffing himself into oratory. So you're saying, Inspector, that we were deceived at the very graveside itself? Purbright inclined his head. Deceived, Councillor, yes, but not by a ghost. By the living. The coffin contained, at best, token remains, perhaps nothing more than ballast to give it weight. And when the grave was disturbed months later, what did we find? An empty shell, lid cast into the river, plate removed. It was not a resurrection. It was stagecraft. He let the word hang. Stagecraft. It was a word Flaxborough understood. The town knew theatre when it saw it and usually preferred it to truth. The pawning of the ring, Purbright went on, was the first slip. That ring, buried with Vesper according to family and undertaker, reappeared in Blenkinsop's ledger. Leonard brought it in. But Leonard is no mastermind. He acted under direction. His muttered words, overheard by the pawnbroker, betray him. She'll not wait. That she was not Vesper risen, but a very living woman who commanded him with threats and persuasion. Blenkinsop, eager to prove his usefulness, nodded vigorously. Yes, Inspector, that's just what he said. She, he said. Purbright's gaze moved to Mrs. Dawes, who sat rigid, her eyes fixed ahead. Mrs. Dawes, landlady to Leonard, you kept him under your roof, fed him, instructed him. You told him to pawn the ring, to carry the handbag, to place it where gossip would feed on it. You frightened him with talk of shame, of the town turning against him, until he obeyed. You played on his weakness, and in doing so you manipulated the entire town. A murmur went round the table. Leonard whispered, I didn't want to, Inspector. She said everyone would think I'd robbed Aunt Vesper's grave if I didn't do as she said. Indeed, Purbright said gently, and so you obeyed. The handbag planted, the ring pawned, the coffin lid loosed, all to suggest a widow who walked again. It was cunning, because while the town chased shadows, no one looked too closely at you, Mrs. Dawes, or at the small stream of money that began to flow your way. Mrs. Dawes snapped her head toward him, voice sharp as a pin. You've no proof, stories and guesses, that's all. You can't tie me to a grave or a ring. Purbright smiled faintly, the sort of smile that made people uneasy without knowing why. Proof, madam, lies not only in objects, but in behaviour. You denied knowledge of the boatyard, when every soul in Flaxborough knows it by smell alone. You shouted down tales of a veiled woman, though none had accused you. And you pressed Leonard into silence with looks more eloquent than threats. These together prove more than paper. He turned then to Mrs. Reeve, seated quietly at the end of the table. You, madam, heard a sigh in the church on the day of the funeral. Not the sigh of a corpse, but the sigh of those complicit, relieved their performance, had convinced the congregation. You remembered it because it was out of place. That memory, small though it seemed, was the first crack. Mrs. Reeve, startled, nodded slowly. Yes, I suppose it was. I thought it was only the wind, but now, Purbright said softly, we see it for what it was. Human nerves, not divine mystery. Silence settled. Even Councillor Chubb, for once, had no interruption. Purbright drew the threads together with the same politeness he might use in explaining directions. There was no ghost. There was only fear. A woman's fear of poverty, perhaps, or of losing her hold over those around her. She clothed that fear in Vesper's veil, used Leonard as her errand boy, and let the town's own appetite for drama do the rest. The grave, the handbag, the pawned ring, they were props, nothing more. He closed his notebook with a soft snap. The truth, ladies and gentlemen, is that Mrs. Vesper Quillam remains as dead as she was in February. What has been alive these months is a story told, embroidered and performed. And now it is finished. Mrs. Dawes's face had drained of colour. She opened her mouth to retort, but no words came. Leonard slumped, relieved and ruined at once. Blenkinsop wiped his brow. Purbright rose, smoothing his coat. There will, of course, be formalities. Statements, charges, the dreary apparatus of law. But for the town, the matter is closed. They need only know that the widow has not walked. They will be comforted by that, even as they miss the drama. He inclined his head, courteous as always, and stepped out into the sunlight. The square outside bustled on, oblivious to revelations. Children played, traders shouted, and a cat slept on a doorstep. Flaxborough would soon fold this affair into its long memory, to be retold in pubs and parlours for years, polished into anecdote. The ghost widow would fade, replaced by the ordinary truth of greed and fear. Purbright, walking back to the station, felt the satisfaction not of triumph, but of completion. Another human puzzle quietly set in order, another town tremor calmed. He knew already that tomorrow would bring some new folly, a councillor's scandal, a misplaced will, perhaps even another handbag. But for now, Flaxborough returned to its routines, and Purbright, as ever, returned to his paperwork. The town of Flaxborough had a way of mending itself after disturbance, though never quite in the same shape as before. It was not resilience so much as habit. People had lived too long with scandal, misfortune, and one another's oddities to let any single story permanently uproot them. And so, in the days following Inspector Purbright's quiet revelation at the town hall, life resumed its customary rhythm, though with a new layer of knowingness beneath it. The market square, once thrumming with speculation about ghosts and graveyards, shifted back to the practicalities of carrots and wool. Mrs Bellamy's buffet at the railway station saw renewed trade, her sausage rolls now accompanied by customers who felt compelled to whisper about coffins while dunking them in tea. The Spalding sisters, still undefeated in their campaign of embroidery, both textile and conversational, spoke less of Vesper's resurrection and more of Mrs Dawes's downfall, though they insisted upon retelling the story, with Vesper appearing at least once at Skegness Promenade, in full veil and black gloves. The vicar preached a sermon on the dangers of superstition, warning against the temptation to see phantoms where there were only shadows. He did not name Mrs Dawes directly, but the congregation knew well enough where the finger of caution pointed. Mrs Reeve, sitting quietly in the front pew, felt a secret pride that her remembered sigh in the church had mattered to the inspector's reasoning. She had repeated the detail often enough to friends in the town, each time allowing herself to sound faintly astonished at her own importance. As for Leonard Quillam, he drifted like a paper boat caught between currents. Freed from his landlady's oppressive influence, he looked less cowed, though still uneasy in his own skin. He was seen once or twice in the company of the pawnbroker, Blenkinsop, who had adopted him in a half-paternal, half-apologetic fashion. Leonard now walked with the air of a man determined to avoid all graveyards, all handbags, and most women in veils for the remainder of his days. Mrs Dawes, meanwhile, had lost her dominion. Charged with fraud and other misdemeanours, she occupied a cell whose damp walls could not be lectured into order. Her vinegar tongue had soured into silence, though even silence carried its own venom when delivered by her. The town, while scandalized, was not surprised. Many remarked that it was just like her, which suggested that everyone had suspected her long before Purbright made it official, though naturally no one had said so at the time. Inspector Purbright himself was conspicuous by his inconspicuousness. He made no speeches, offered no public statements beyond what was necessary. The town did not require theatrics from him. It had generated quite enough of its own. Instead, he was seen walking his usual route from station to market to station again, sipping indifferent tea, nodding politely to those who tried to thank him. His colleagues at the station found him one morning writing his report with his customary neatness, as though the whole affair had been little more than a misfiled letter now returned to the proper cabinet. Sergeant Maltravers, still dissatisfied, muttered one afternoon that the case had ended too quietly. "No chase, no excitement, sir. Only a landlady scaring her lodger into errands. People wanted something grander." Purbright looked up with mild amusement. "Grandness is rarely true, Sergeant, and truth is rarely grand. We must take comfort in that." Maltby, ever earnest, asked if the town would ever stop believing in the ghost of Vesper Quillam. "Oh, they will," Purbright said, "once a fresher story comes along. A councillor's indiscretion, perhaps, or an unexplained noise at the brewery. Ghosts never last long here. Scandal does. And so it proved. Within a fortnight, the town's gossip had already shifted to Councillor Chubb, whose attempts to raise funds for a new war memorial had somehow resulted in 3 missing cheques and an unfortunate quarrel in the Angel Inn. The ghost widow was, for the moment, set aside like last year's hymn books, still remembered but less urgently. Yet subtle changes lingered. The railway station's gentleman's waiting room was scrubbed so fiercely that the wood bore scars of polish. The graveyard saw more flowers than usual, as though people wished to reassure the dead of their continued respect. And in private parlours, conversations took on a slightly cautious tone, each person wondering whether their words might one day be quoted in a police inspector's explanation. Purbright, in his own quiet way, took note of all this. He saw how the town folded the Quillam affair into its pattern, neither discarding nor wholly embracing it. He understood that Flaxborough was less interested in truth than in the comfort of having a story, any story, to explain its oddities. If that story happened to involve a ghostly widow, so much the better. On an autumn evening, as the church bell tolled 7, Purbright sat by his office window, watching the lamplighter move down the street. He thought of Vesper Quillam, not as a ghost, nor even as a victim, but as a woman whose life had been woven of habit, whose death had been turned into theatre, and whose absence had given others the stage they craved. He thought too of Leonard and of Mrs. Dawes, and of all the small, secret hungers that drove people to build stories out of shadows. None of it surprised him. Flaxborough was nothing if not consistent in its peculiarities. He opened his notebook and wrote his final line on the case. The town does not fear the dead. It fears the living who use the dead to frighten it. He closed the book, placed it neatly on his desk, and reached for the first of several dreary reports awaiting his attention. Outside, the lamplighter finished his work and disappeared into the evening. The town sighed back into its ordinary rhythm, comforted by routine, unsettled only in the way Flaxborough was always unsettled. Quietly, beneath the surface. And with that, Inspector Purbright returned to his paperwork, as if nothing remarkable had happened at all.